Basic training. Russian tanks surrounded a large garage that their opponents were taking cover inside of. A tank driver ran back inside shouting, "It's an Russian siege. What do we do? Should we surrender? We only have a Type 2 medium tank, a Panzer IV Osfef and a Hetzer. And to top it off, not only are we under enemy siege, we aren't used to fighting in the snow. Calm down and take a drink from your flasks. We aren't going to surrender, we are going to come up with a battle plan to counter the Russian siege and win this fight." The American tank troops and infantry units took a drink from their flasks as instructed and formed a circle with the unit commander, and he laid out a large sheet of paper and began to discuss battle plans with his troops. As 1 hour passed by, the tank troops were repairing their tanks with the help of the engineer units of the infantry unit troops. A messenger from the enemy walked into the area where the Allies were at and immediately took notice of how new their tanks looked, and they knew the answer to their question. "No, we will never surrender." Sarge steps forward to the messenger and said, "We will fight until we die. Tell your commander that we will break through their siege and destroy any of their unit that gets in our way." The messenger bites their lip before turning around and leaving the building and returning to their commander to relay Sarge's message. Sarge climbs on top of the Panzer and said, "All right troops. Form up. It's time to discuss the battle plan once more." After everyone gathered in front of Sarge, he said, "Since we aren't used to fighting in these weather conditions, I added a voice module guide to help you as you fight. Now for the battle plan." Sarge jumped down, off of the Panzer and opened a detailed map and pointed out circle locations and pointed to each one saying, "I want the Hetzer to be at a sniping distance from the enemy heavy, deal as much damage as you can. If you're spotted, go to this spot here and wait for the Type 2 unit to arrive. If they don't arrive in 10 minutes, go hide at this final spot. But this one is very dangerous because it leads right back to where we are now. As for the Type 2 unit, after the Hetzer is out of sight from the siege, you and the 1st Airborne Battalion will head west and lead the left side of the enemy forces away from the siege formation. The APC will provide the Type 2 with cover from enemy fire. Once you reach area F1 on the map, turn your turret 80 degrees and fire 3 shells, then move to area D6 and try to avoid taking any fire from there. I'll take the Panzer and wait until both sides are clear before I make my move. Once I start moving, I'll head toward area A7 and shoot my way to what's left of the heavy tank and destroy it myself with an armor-piercing shot. Does everybody understand their roles?" "Yes, sir." "Does everyone know what it is that they're supposed to do?" "Yes, sir." "Good. Now gear up. We're about to head out. Remember the plan. Hetzer, sneak out from the backside. And find their heavy Type 2 unit, armor or personal carriers. Load up and get ready. You're about to be up next." "Roger that, Sarge." "The Type 2 unit and escorts are both ready to move out." "Good. Make sure your communication module is online while you are able to." "Communication module. My communication module is online, sir." "Hetzer is retreating to E4. We dealt a lot of damage to their T-35, but they spotted us as we were reloading." "All right, good job, keep me posted, Hetzer." "Well, Type 2 units, it's your turn now. Remember to stick to the plan and everything will work out in the end for us." "Type 2 unit, move out." Sarge climbed into the Panzer and waited for the siege formation to split up before he fired several rounds into the center row, destroying them, and then he drove east towards E8, which is where the T-35 was coming from. He picks up the communication module radio and asks, "How is everyone? You guys still kicking?" Type 2 responded saying, "This is Type 2 unit, we barely pulled it off but we did it. This is Hetzer, we're just fine, thanks to your great planning, Sarge." Sarge sighed in relief then said, "Good, drinks are on me tonight if we pull this thing off. Hey Hetzer? How many more shots would you say that T-35 need to take before it's taken out?" Hetzer's radio was static for a moment, then they said, "Probably just 1 shell, Sarge. We did a real number on them seeing as how slow both their turret and movement speed was." Sarge picks up the radio and said, "Change of plans, Hetzer, how close are you to your first assigned position?" Hetzer replies saying, "Not that far, I take it you want me to return to it?" Sarge says, "That's right. The T-35 isn't moving an inch, something fishy is going on here." Type 2, is your module sat viewer working? If so, mark A9 with it and tell me what you see. Type 2 here, they are just playing cards and drinking. I guess they got sick of waiting and decided to get out of the tank and. That's enough. How dare they not take this seriously? If they won't then, I will. Panzer. Fire. The Panzer fired an armor-piercing round at the T-35 and won the match. My name is Ise, but I usually get called Sarge. Although I'm not quite sure why though. Anyways, I'm being transferred from the Allied German Tank Division base to a school in America only to be told that I would be briefed later. So I headed outside and started my way to my tank garage and saw my tank crew cleaning the tank and I shouted, Hey boys. Why don't we take a break and have lunch early? They climbed down and the radio operator asked me, Hey Commander, is it true that you're leaving us soon? The rest of them looked at me and I said, It's true, I'll be briefed and transferred to America in a bit. I wanted to see you three before I left though. Wolf, my gunner, asks me, Are you taking the Panzer with you, Sarge? He looks at him and said, I would guess so, I can't be certain however. Commander Ise, please come to the war room for a briefing at once. I smiled and said, I guess I'll be seeing you three on the battlefield soon, don't disappoint me. As he steps jumped out of a jet, Ise climbed into his falling tank and shouted, Panzer vor. It slammed onto the ground and he starts it up and drives the Panzer on the side of the street until a girl shouted, What is that thing? Ise turned it off and opens the hatch and asked her, What? You've never seen a tank before? It's a Panzer IV. She replied with, No. I mean, I know that it's a tank, obviously. But why are you driving it on the side of the street? The boy grinned and said, I just wanted to see if she was okay before I took it to Tankery High School. And isn't it a bit rude to not introduce yourself before asking others questions in America? The girl scratched the side of her head and replied saying, Yeah it is, wait. You said, from America, are you not from here? Ise. My name is Ise, and I'm transferring to America from the 64th Armored Tank Division of the Allied German base in southern Germany. Now for your name? The girl froze and said, That's the one of best tank forces in Germany. Sorry, my name is Beth Adams, and I'm a first year at Tankery High School. Can I meet the rest of your crew? Ise looked down and back before saying they are back at home. I should get going to school, want to ride with me, Miss Beth? You won't make it back on foot. Ise climbed out and held out his hand then said, I can teach you how to drive the Panzer IV if you want. She looked at him and down then back up and grabs his hand. Ise helps Beth up onto the Panzer and she climbed in first, then Ise who asks her, Is this your first time being inside a tank, Beth? She looks at two chairs and asks, Yes, which one do I sit in? Ise closed the hatch and said, The one on the left, once you're ready, I'll begin your lessons. Beth sat down in the seat and looked out the window and Ise said, There are 3 levers, forward, reverse, and park, just like in a car. The one on the furthermost outside, if you push it forward, you'll have set it in drive. You control it by moving it in the direction you want the tank to move. Try getting us to the end of the street. Beth pushed the driver's lever forward and the Panzer moved forward as she saw it through the window from inside the driver's seat. As she reached the end of the street, Beth pulled the brake lever and stops the tank as Ise turned the turret front side. He opened the hatch and said, All right Beth, you did great for your first time driving a tank, time to get out. He climbs out and Ise helped Beth out of the Panzer before saying, You've got talent, Beth, I'll give you that. See you at school. She jumps down and Ise drove towards the outside of the street, leaving Beth behind. As students were entering the school, an engine roared throughout the area and a massive gray tank approached the school's backside and shut off. The canopy opens and a boy with white hair and blue eyes walks inside. The principal asks him, You must be the military transfer I've requested, aren't you? Please follow me to my office. After closing the door, the principal and he poured 2 cups of coffee and placed them on the table before sitting across from Ise and asks, What is your name? The tank commander took a sip of coffee and said, Ise, my name Ise. Care to explain why it is you requested to have me torn away from my only friends? The prince smiled and said, Easy now Ise, you'll make more friends here. Actually, this school is at a serious crisis. Ise froze then puts down his drink and asks, A crisis? Indulge me, just what's troubling you so badly that it requires me? This school will be shut down, unless. Ise placed his empty cup on the table and said, You want me to train and command tankery units, and if we succeed the school gets to stay open. The principal stood up and bows at Ise, begging him to do it and he said, I would, but there's just one problem, I don't have my own crew. The principal stood up straight and said, I may have a solution, take part in classes, you don't have to succeed in them of course, just make some friends and find out who is more suitable for your Panzer crew. Ise flinched and said, I only need 2 more, a gunner, and a loader. Beth the first-year student in Class 2B can be the driver, and of course I'm the commander. The principal looks out of his window and asks, You do know you'll be searching for unused tanks with students, right Ise? He smirked and asks, I already have a map of various tanks in my tank. You see principal, back in Germany, we did some more than just sit on our butts all day cleaning and repairing tanks and modifying aircraft. We went on what we called treasure hunts, so finding them won't be the issue, no. It's what comes next. I stood up and headed to the door and stopped before saying, One more thing. I'll be driving my tank on the here every day, so try to keep the jealousy to a minimum, okay? I think I've earned it since you're the one responsible for ruining my life. Ise looked back at the principal with a very scary look and then left the room. The principal said, "Of course. Ise." As Ise closed the door to the principal's office, a girl with black hair stood in front of him and stared at him. Ise asked her, "You own that Panzer IV parked in the back of the school?" Ise sighs and asks her, "How do you know what kind of tank I own?" She got closer and he said, "Yes, it's mine. Why?" She backed away and said, "I want to shoot its gun." Ise looked at her and asks her, "Huh?" Beth walks up and said, "Oh, hi, Commander Ise. Is Amani causing you trouble?" Ise turned his attention to Beth and asked her, "Did you just call me Commander Ise?" "Beth?" She smiled and said, "That's right. I heard that you chose to have me as your driver for your tank. I think the name fits you." Ise sighed and said, "If you're going to give me a nickname, it may as well be Sarge." Beth smiled and said, "Okay, Sarge, is Amani bothering you?" Ise crossed his arms and says, "Only call me that during training and live combat. And no, she's not. She's just pestering me to let her fire my Panzer's gun." Amani looks at him and says, "That wasn't very nice of you to say of me, Ise. I know of a good spot." Ise shouts, "That isn't the problem here." Beth sighs and said, "How about we just let her shoot one round? If anything goes wrong, I'll get the maintenance club to take a look at your tank and we'll put the blame on the principal and charge him $68 apiece for each part fixed." Ise sighed then says, "Fine, but only one." Amani smiled happily and followed both Beth and Ise as they climbed into the Panzer, and Amani stared at it from the outside until Ise opens the hatch and shouted, "Come on, Amani." She rushed into the tank and Beth started it up before putting it in reverse and backing out of the parking lot and shifts it into drive and left the school. After 30 minutes of driving through an empty pathway, Amani shouts, "We're here." Ise opened the hatch and saw a massive desert area with a target far out, and he says, "All right, Amani, if you want to join the crew, as gunner, you'll have to hit that directly. It's on E5 1,500 meters away. Load a high explosive shell in there." Amani loads the ammunition ordered into the turret and adjusts the gun to the coordinates and waits for the command. Ise shouted, "Fire." Amani fires and the tank shook a little as the shell headed towards target, and Ise watched it explode. He pats the top of the tank and shouted, "Hand me the binoculars." He zooms in with them and saw that there was almost nothing left of the target, and he climbs back into the tank and says, "Let's go back to school." After returning to the school, Beth, Ise, and Amani exits the tank, and Ise held out his hand to Amani and said, "You decimated that, great work. Welcome to my crew, Amani." She smiled and shook his hand before saying, "I won't let you down, Ise." Over the intercoms, a voice said, "Ise, come to the school council office immediately." He sighs and the two girls looked at him, and Ise said, "No, I didn't do anything wrong. It's probably related to the conversation I had with the principal." He opened the door and walks into the school, heading towards the school council office as he ignores the other students' murmurs and gossip. Ise stood in front of the doors and knocked, then said, "It's Ise." A voice from the other side said, "Come in." He enters and a girl sitting at a desk with papers spread across and her hands underneath her chin said, "So you're the one who's going to help us keep our school alive? How do you plan to find us any tanks?" Ise reached inside of his back pocket and handed her a map with circled locations, and she asks, "What's this?" Ise smirked and said, "Oh, that? Those are the locations of the tanks you're going to need for the upcoming tourney. I've already handled the equipment and parts for them. But as for the tanks' conditions, you're going to need to find a way to get them fixed up and repaired. Of course, that's not the only map of treasures that I possess. Is there anything else?" The council president sighed and said, "Yes, actually. You can't lead the tankers without one more member, right?" Ise looks at her and said, "I've already got it covered." She smirks and said, "Is that so? You haven't been to one class yet." Ise opens a stick of beef jerky and says, "And yet I've found one." The president looked in her desk drawer and noticed that one of her snacks was gone, and she shouted, "Hey! When did you? Never mind, who is this loader girl you speak of?" Ise points behind the president and said, "Her name is Kagamine, she's sitting on the left bench in the center courtyard playing on her phone." The council president drops her pencil and shouted, "Hold on. She's a third year." Ise nodded and said, "Yup, and the second best mobile gamer at this school. She lost to me and a deal was sealed." The council president slowly turned to face Ise and asks him, "You beat her in a game?" Ise replied with, "Back in Germany there wasn't much to do, so we just played all sorts of video games on our phones when we weren't on the clock. Needless to say, I had the least amount of stuff to do, so I had more time to play games. She just so happened to choose one that I've maxed out my stats on. I tried to tell her, but she wouldn't budge." The president sighs as she sat down and began to open up a stick of beef jerky and said, "Wow, you must have been bored." Ise crumbled up his trash and said, "Not really, they like to keep us busy back at the base. That's why my tank's garage was built near the training grounds when I was back in Germany." It let my crew and I have fewer things to do so we'd have more time with each other and to ourselves. I squeezed the trash even tighter and said, sorry but, could we stop talking about that? You're picking at an unhealed wound. The council principal smiled and said, sure we can stop. But you know, it's almost like you're a completely different person when you're talking about it. Now. Commander Ise. The Tankery Tournament will run like this. The tournament has 4 branches, the British University of Matilda, the German School of Advanced Armory, the Russian School of Katyusha, and us, the American School, Sherman Academy. There will be 8 rounds each, giving each school at least one more chance to get payback on the school that lost to, as well as depleting a point to the losing team and giving it to the winning team. If a team's heavy tank is defeated, the opposing team wins the match. Ise looked down like he was zoned out and the council president asks him, hey Ise. You still with us, Commander? You look like you've just been dazed inside of a tank from a nearby shell explosion. Ise flinches and said, yeah, I'm fine, I've been briefed on the rules already before I was transferred here. President, have you been in a tank before? She blinks at the question and said, figures you wouldn't know. I come from a long family line of tank gunners. But. Ise looked at her and said, I see, I won't press the matter further. I was just going to offer you for a ride with me and my Panzer around campus to clear our minds. But I'll drop it for now. She stood up quickly, knocking things around on her desk and said, I don't mind. Ise crossed his arms and said, you have preparations to make, don't you? He put 5 folded pieces of paper on her desk and said, hopefully they're still like my brothers and I left them. Ise put his hand on the doorknob and the council president said, I'll hold you to that offer on the tank ride, Commander. He nods and said, I await your questioning on one of those. And you can expect a reasonable answer. With that, Commander Ise exits the room and began to walk down the hallway. Ise walked outside and looked at his tank and said, you and I have been through a lot together, haven't we? A voice from behind, walking towards him said, Panzer vor. Ise froze and Amani walked beside the Panzer sleepily said, Panzer vor. Kagame turns off her phone and said, I can't believe you dragged me into this, Commander. But whatever. Panzer vor. Commander Ise looked around and said, you 3 are really determined to win this thing, aren't you? Kagame looks at him and said, well, it's partially your fault. The rest is the school's. Beth interrupted and said, nobody's at fault here. Let's just have fun and get along. Ise smiled and shouted, Panzer vor. Ise and the crew climbed into the Panzer and Beth drove the others home before asking, Commander? He climbed down and said, it's fine, I can drive myself home. She looked at him and says, about that, I was actually wondering if I could see where it is you live? Ise looks at Beth confused and asked her, why do you need to know that? She looks away and said, you know how it is that I drove the others to their homes? I was just wondering if something were to happen or come up, that you'd have a backup plan. Ise sighed and said, location, D7 now. Beth immediately started up the Panzer and drove through the streets and to the ordered location and Ise said, location, B5 now. She turned and drove to that area and Ise said, turn off the tank and come on outside with me. She turned off the tank and climbs out, then took hold of Ise's hand, was pulled to the track of the Panzer and he said, I can't get you inside without getting you a license to enter the Panzer Division garrison. Sorry Beth. You wanted to know it is where it was that I lived, it's here. I told you that I was transferred from an Allied German tank division in southern Germany, this is where it was too. Beth looked down as she thought to herself, it feels like every time I try to get to know him better, I'm just tearing open a deeper scar. Ise pats her shoulder and said, we should get going, here. I'll drive you home this time. Ise climbs on top of the Panzer and Beth approaches him and asks, Ise? Am I tearing you apart? He froze, thinking of an honest yet painless way to reply, and Beth said, I still want to drive the Panzer with you 3. So please. Be honest with me. Ise sighs and said, I don't mind talking about home, I was born in America after all. You aren't hurting me. Beth, I call those boys my brothers because of how well we got along together when we were around each other. I met them the same way I did all of you, that's why I agreed to come here and help. That's why I left them behind in Germany. I needed new friends, ones that I could rely on. Not some idiots that slacked off whenever the chief's back was turned. Do you know how angry that made me, just seeing them do that? I have first-hand battlefield tank warfare experience, you need that in a tank commander. Not just plopping a soldier in one and telling him he's in charge. All I'm trying to say is, you and the rest of the crew bring me joy to see that true spirit and courage in students would step forth and fight for what they truly love. I'm not offended by you at all, Beth, now let's get you home. Ise bent over and extended his arm towards Beth and she took his hand, then was lifted onto the Panzer and enters it after him. Ise turns it on and Beth asked him, We should add some extensive layers to Panzer's armor before the tournament. Ise nods in approval and said, I think you're right, we also need a bigger ammo rack and some additions. Have yourself and the crew meet me by the school gates tomorrow. Beth nods and the tank stops as Ise says, well, we're here, time for you get out. Beth opened the hatch and Ise said, wait, I had fun today, thanks for spending time with me. Beth climbed to the top of the Panzer and asks Ise, just how old are you, Ise? He looked at her and said, I'm 19 years old, I was born and raised on the battlefield. She looked at Panzer and Ise said, Panzer IV's been with me since I was drafted into southern Germany, it was a gift. Beth nods and starts to walk towards her door and heard the Panzer start moving again and she stood still, recalling the moment that she first met Ise. It was right across from her house where he just was. She smiled as a raindrop hit her head and she saluted and it started to rain as she headed into her house. The next day Ise was behind the school in front of several students. He said, I'm sure you've memorized the locations on your maps, but just in case not, I've prepared some earpieces to help keep us in touch if you need directions. I know where each one is my memory. But I want to see your teamwork and dedication to find the vehicles first. There is the APC Armored Personnel Carrier. Then there is the M2A1 and finally, the Mortar 2. Find these and call each find in, a armored vehicle carrier will arrive to bring them here. Begin. After 20 minutes passed by, Team 1 called in that they have found the M2A1 topside underneath a hill. And transport was sent to pick it up. Ise looked at his wristwatch and the council president teasingly asked him, are you expecting someone, Commander? He bopped her head. She said, I was only joking. Ise glanced at her and fiercely asked her, we are in the middle of a drill, do you seriously think that there's time for joking? She stepped back away and said, wow, even in searching drills you're scary. The next morning, Beth was eating breakfast and heard the tank pass by and so she rushed outside and saluted and Ise stops and opens the hatch and salutes back before continuing on his way. Beth finishes her breakfast and grabs her bag before rushing to follow the Panzer's track marks and saw that it was parked at a game store that she never knew about. She entered and saw Amani, Kagamine and Ise playing a game competitively and she said, I never knew about this place. Ise pats on the fourth seat and asks her, care to join us? Beth sat down and 15 minutes later all three of them looked down in disbelief and said, I can't believe Beth beat us. Amani's stomach growled and Ise said, how about some lunch? Pick something, it's on me. Amani looked across the street and saw a seafood restaurant and said, how about seafood? Ise smiled and said seafood it is then. After an hour of seafood, Ise paid for the meal and asked them, you three having fun? Amani smiled and said, I'm having a blast. Kagamine says, me too. And Beth said, agreed. Ise smiled and said, great. Ise was working in the garrison maintaining the Panzer's tracks when his phone received a text. He ignored it and proceeded to work on the Panzer until it went off again and he stood up and sighed before wiping his face with a towel and pulled his phone out from his pocket and turned it on. The first message was from Kagamine. He looked at it and reads it, Commander Ise has been added to the group chat. The second was a message from Amani, what should we call our squad? Ise turns off his phone and puts it away as a person who passed him said, you missed some treads, Commander, that could be bad on the field. It was a girl from the base that he occasionally chats with as he eats his MREs. Ise looked at her and said, short brown hair, brown eyes. Ashley. Why are you here? She looks at him and said, I love Tankery. He always wanted to give it a shot. And I heard that you're teaching it at Nakamura High School to keep it up and running? Ise sighed and said, yeah, sort of. We're in the phase of the vehicles being retrieved right now. The next step is to Ashley interrupts him by saying, to find out what skill each student has after the vehicles are in working conditions again, right? Ise crossed his arms and looked up at her and said, yeah, you seem to know a lot about this kind of stuff, Ashley. She smiled and said, well, Tankery is in my blood. I come from a family that's Generation S come from Tankery. What about you, Ise? He looked at Ashley and pointed at himself asking, me? What about me do you want to know, Corporal? He returned to fixing his tank and said, Beth messed you up pretty hard today didn't she, Panzer? Ashley observed the tank and said, your tank is an unmodified German Panzer IV. If you put armor on the sides covering the tracks, you could save yourself some time, Sarge. Ise froze and said, even you are calling me that now, Ashley? She put her hand on his shoulder and said, everything'll work out. He pulled out his phone and types in, how about, the Panzer Division? 3 seconds passed by and each of the crew sent a thumbs up emoji and said, it's perfect. Ise puts away his phone and heads back towards his Panzer and continued its maintenance for the afternoon. After he finished checking everything, Ise climbs out of his tank and was met with both a towel and a bottled water and asks, the heck? Ashley giggles and said, you smell like oil and sweat, Ise. He turned off the radio and said, "It's part of the works, those kids will have to get used to it if they want to keep their school open." Ashley took a sip from the bottled water and said, "You're right about that, the girls you bonded with have already began to adjust, have you noticed it too, Ise?" He took a sip from his beer and said, "Yeah, they really love being inside the Panzer with me." Ashley jumps down off of the table and said, "I've got reports to write, have fun teaching them, Commander." Ise picked up his Luger P-38 handgun and tossed the empty bottle over the fence and shot it before stretching and sets up his sleeping booth next to the Panzer and lays down under the shade and closed his eyes. Early the next morning, Ise picked up his stuff and climbs into the Panzer and starts it up, then drove it to the garrison gates and swipes his card, opening it and driving it through Beth Street and saw her. She walked up to him and he asked her, "You want to drive the Panzer, Beth?" She smiled and said, "You don't mind, Ise?" He yawned and said, "I'm picking up the crew this morning, and I didn't sleep too well last night, can you drive her for me?" Beth climbed in and said, "It smells like sweat and oil in here, Commander." Ise sat on the side and said, "You'll have to get used to it, all of you, if you want your school to stay open." He yawned and said, "Let's start by picking up Kagame." Beth said, "But she's the farthest away from me." Ise was already sleeping and Beth looks at him with a smile and said, "Panzer IV, right Ise?" After arriving at the school, Ise woke up and stood up, climbs outside of his tank and saw his crew waiting for him and he asked them, "What are you for doing here? Aren't you supposed to be in class?" Amani looked at him and said, "It's about time you woke up." Beth looked at her and shouted, "Amani. That was rude." Kagame giggles and Ise laughs and then said, "No, she's right, I was out for too long. I deserve that. Let's get to the Panzer Division lessons." The girls cheered and followed Ise to the back of the school where the vehicles that were waiting were. Ise and his crew reached the back of the school and the girls were put in the groups of students and lessons began. Ise looked up and said, "So we have 3 American armored personnel carriers, 4 British Valentine medium tanks, 3 German Panzer III light tanks, along with 1 American M44 artillery unit. Now I'm just going to tell you before we begin. You may already know that the repair club is used to being covered in sweat and oil. But in Tankery, everyone is covered in it, the crew itself is covered in sweat and oil. Especially on the battlefield. Now, I will find out what role you are suited for in your crew and teach you Tankery." The APC were first as they were the most simple. I said, "The armored personnel carries hold troops or objects as transport on the battlefield. But they can also be used as shields or explosive traps. The repair club will repair this one." Ise took a armful of explosives and entered the APC and exits after starting it up and pushing it towards the target and detonating it as it entered the location. The APC landed in between him and the students and he said, "That is a trap. If you are transporting or protecting another tank, use the APC as a shield to cover both sides of the tank. Once the APC has taken a lot of damage, during cover mission, back the vehicle up to the back of the tank and retreat." Ise looked up from the charts in his hands and at the students then shouts, "Those who want to drive the APC stand beside them." 12 students from each club stood beside each APC and Ise adds, "I will show you each a special battlefield technique for your vehicles when we are done. Also, once you choose your vehicle, you are eternally connected with it, understand?" The girls marched one foot next to the other and saluted as they shouted, "Understood, Sarge." Ise pin spins as he reads through the list of recovered equipment and vehicles and flicks it up, then caught it pointed at the Valente tanks and said, "Next up are medium tank assignment." Each second, third and first year from each classroom and club approaches the tanks and said, "We will take the Valentine tanks, Commander Ise. We've already decided a design for each one to along with an emblem and squad name." Intrigued, Ise said, "Very well, the tanks are yours then. I will train you after the light tanks training is finished." The student council president looked at the list in Ise's hand said, "But Ise, all that's left on the chart you're holding are the parts you requested we find. What light tanks are you talking about?" Ise smiled and asks, "Why do you think I requested the school to find those parts? I made a few special orders from some of my old war buddies." She shivered at the word war and thought to herself, "I thought he was just talking out of his ass at first, but now I'm not so sure." The sound of multiple engines entered the field and 3 other officers walked towards Ise and said, "Ise, you've grown up since I've last seen you." "Oh, what's this? Do you perhaps have a hair?" Ise punched the officer into one of the vehicles and shouted, "I'm teaching school kids Tankery and battle tactics. In order for them to keep their school open, so show me some respect." Wolf. He stood up and cracked his jaw back into place and said, "That's why they took you away from us? For something like this?" Ise sighed and said, "Brother, as much as I would love to settle this dispute the old way, we can't, not here, not now. There are kids here, so I'll ask you one time only. Please, leave this place." Ise handed the clipboard to the student council president and shouted all available units. Panzer IV. Aim your machine guns at Wolf. Ise asks, well Wolf, what'll it be? Are you going to leave? Or do you wish to die? Wolf glared at Ise and said, America has changed you Ise. He turned around and walked away. Ise loosened his grip of his P-38 pistol behind him and said, disengage. Exit your tanks for evaluation. The students got out of their vehicles and high-fived each other and shouts to each other, that was fun. And, my medium tank could use some repairs, it's all rusty in there. Ise smiled and shouted, everyone. Come here. I have a paper for each of you to read and sign. They approached Ise and grabs the paper, and Ise said, all of you will be facing me tomorrow, remember to work as a team, and everything I've taught you today that will be your first real training lesson. Panzer IV. Back at the garrison. Ise was working on his Panzer and Ashley walked out saying, good lord. What is that smell? Ise rolls out from underneath his tank and asked her, what do you think it is? Sweat and oil. Just more of it this time. Panzer had an oil leak so I had to fix her up. Did you need something, Ashley? Ise rolled back underneath the tank. Ashley looked at the tank, covering her nose and said, yeah, I heard that the student will be going against you tomorrow, is that correct? Ise grabbed a nearby wrench and cranked a bolt to the left before saying, yup, that's right. Ashley looks at him and firmly says, Ise, we need to talk. He puts down the wrench and grabs a screwdriver before saying, I'm kind of busy at the moment, can't you just tell me here? Ashley squeezed a canned soda so tightly that it exploded and she shouted, now, Ise. He froze and rolled from underneath the Panzer and wiped the grease off of his face with a towel and said, fine. What is it? Ashley said you're just as incompetent as they come, aren't you? My little sister adores both you and your Panzer. Ise looked at and asks, who's your sister, Ashley? She crossed her arms and said, Beth. Ise looked at his tank and said, that explains a lot actually. Ashley looked at him fiercely and said, care to elaborate? Ise began, lately, she's been wanting to drive Panzer to school, but not just to school either, she's been wanting to drive its crew home. Ashley looks at Ise and asked him, have you tried telling her? No. Ise looked at Ashley funny and said, that's the very first answer she got. Why do you think Panzer has been in need of so many repairs lately? Speaking of which. Ise turned to face Panzer and begun to head towards it and said, I have work to do. See you tomorrow Ashley. The next day. Ise arrived at the meadows and parks his Panzer before climbing out and approaching the middle of the field to salute his opponent. A girl wearing the school's uniform and a Soviet military cap saluted him and said, good luck Commander. After the salutes, the battle began. The students sent out an unmanned APC loaded with smoke and fled further away from the commander as he fired at the infantry unit and skid past it, through the smoke. He closed his eyes and held his breath, listening to his surroundings. A8 C6 F8 and B2 he opened his eyes and lets out a breath as he said, I could very well end this now, but I won't. I'll give these kids time to feel what it's like to be a tank crew. Wait. Beth. Stop the Panzer. She hard pulls the lever back and asks, what's wrong Commander Chink? Beth puts Panzer in full reverse and turns to the left and moves away as Amani fired armor-piercing shells at the Hetzer hid in the tall grass to the northeast. As the Valentine tanks were headed to capture the base, the commander was following from far behind, camouflaged by the grass after taking down the Hetzer. Panzer fired a high-explosive shell in between the two remaining decoy APCs, flipping them off their current courses on their sides. The Panzer approached the medium tanks like a vicious tiger hungry for its next meal, firing armor-piercing rounds one after another, both hitting and missing the tanks, destroying one of them, severely damaging another while only one remained. The two tanks fired at each other at the same time, causing a massive explosion. Once the smoke cleared, Panzer was heavily wounded and the final medium tank's tracks were destroyed, rendering it incapable of movement but not out. Ise looked at Panzer and said, looks like they did it. Hey Amani. Will you help me fix Panzer? Amani climbed out of the hatch and said, sure, I'll help fix her. Do you three want to help us too? Okay. Hey Sarge. He froze as mumbled not that name again. What is it? Amani said, the others want to help out, can they? Sarge steps in front of Panzer and said, sure. The more the better. The medium tank captured the base after Sarge and his crew finished fixing Panzer. They wiped their faces and drank from their flasks as they waited for the medium to arrive. Sarge pulled out a deck of cards and asks, anyone up for some blackjack? Halfway through blackjack, the tank arrives and the crews get out in numbers as Sarge puts down his hand of cards and said, come on, it's time to finish today's basic training. Sarge exits the Panzer and said congrats. You've passed basic training. Welcome to the Panzer Division. From this day forth you help each other no matter what. Treat each other as family. Back at the garrison. Ise was doing repairs on Panzer and said, What is it this time, Ashley? I'm busy. A familiar voice asks, mind if we help you, Commander? He slowly turned around and asked, we? What the? How did you four get in the garrison? Whatever. If you want to help repair Panzer, then by all means go for it. Beth stood up and asks, hey Sarge? Can I talk to you in private? He cranks a loose screw. The right said, everyone, take a break for a bit. The commander approached Beth and asks her, what it? Is something bothering you? She crouched down and said, be honest with me, Commander, how did they really do? The other three stared at him and Ise said, you want my opinion? Truthfully, it was sloppy, but they worked together and had already made a battle plan ahead of schedule. To put it in simpler words, they did just fine and will continue to grow both in bonds and as a team, a fine addition to the Panzer division. Were you three worried for them? Kagamine looked up and asks him, how long will you be in America, Sarge? He looked up at the darkening sky and said, I guess until I'm transferred to another garrison in another country. Amani looked at him and said, you are a soldier through and through, aren't you? Ise took a swig of his drink before saying, my past is history. Why don't you three head on home? I'll see you tomorrow, thanks for helping me fix Panzer. As he looked at his tank, Ise said, I'll be teaching you and the others how to repair your tanks tomorrow. Be ready. The next day, Ise was standing in front the Tankery units and said, today you will be taught how to repair your tanks. Your tank is your family, so you treat it with true respect. I will not be the one teaching you today as I only know how to repair Panzers. You will be helping each other figure out what needs fixing and how. Panzer Division. Good luck.